He walked up to 8 German bunkers in a single day and cleared every one of them without firing a shot, without dropping a grenade, and without burning a single enemy soldier alive. The Germans surrendered before he even got close. His weapon was so terrifying, so absolute in its promise of death, that hardened Wehrmacht veterans chose captivity over facing what he carried. But here's what nobody talks about. The Geneva Convention would later classify his method as illegal, and the military banned the technique entirely. His name was lost to history, but the men he saved never forgot what he did that day in the winter of 1944. The Hurtgen Forest was a killing ground like no other on the Western Front. American forces had been fighting there since September, and by December, the forest had consumed entire regiments. The trees were so dense that artillery bursts detonated in the canopy, sending shrapnel and wooden splinters raining down on anyone below. You couldn't see 10 yards in any direction. The Germans had turned every clearing, every trail, every depression in the ground into an interlocking field of fire. They built bunkers from logs and earth so well concealed that you'd walk past them until the machine gun opened up. Battalions went in at full strength and came out as companies. Companies went in and came out as platoons. The forest didn't care about tactics or training. It just consumed men. The soldier at the center of this story was a flamethrower operator, a private first class whose name appears in no Medal of Honor citations, no newspaper articles, no official commendation. He was 22 years old, from a small town in Pennsylvania, and he'd been in combat for exactly 19 days when he figured out something that would change the rules of war forever. Flamethrower operators had a life expectancy measured in minutes once the shooting started. The tanks on their backs made them easy targets, and the weapon itself had a range of only about 40 yards. You had to get close, real close. Close enough to see the faces of the men you were about to kill. Most flamethrower operators didn't survive their first engagement. He'd already beaten those odds twice. The mission was simple in concept, impossible in execution. A German strongpoint was holding up the entire advance. 8 reinforced bunkers arranged in a semicircle, mutually supporting, with clear fields of fire across a natural clearing about 60 yards wide. Every approach had been tried. Infantry assaults resulted in wholesale slaughter. Artillery couldn't touch them because of the overhead cover. Tank support was impossible, because the forest was too dense and the ground too broken. 2 companies had already been chewed up trying to take those bunkers. The bodies were still out there in the snow, frozen in the positions where they fell. Command was about to call off the attack entirely when this private stepped forward with an idea that sounded absolutely insane. He told his captain that he could take the bunkers without killing anyone. The captain thought he'd lost his mind. Flamethrowers didn't take prisoners. They created crematoriums. The weapon was designed for one purpose: to burn fortifications and everyone inside them. It was the most feared weapon in the American arsenal, and for good reason. Japanese soldiers on Pacific Islands had thrown themselves on grenades rather than face the flames. But this private had noticed something during his previous engagements, something that nobody else had picked up on. He'd seen what happened to German soldiers when they heard a flamethrower ignite. Even before the flames reached them, even before they were in any real danger, they broke. The sound alone, that distinctive whoosh of igniting fuel, that roar of pressurized flame, it did something to men that bullets and explosives never could. It touched a primal fear that transcended training and discipline. His plan was to use that fear as a weapon itself. He would approach each bunker alone, get within range, and ignite the flamethrower without actually directing the flames at the position. He would let them see it, let them hear it, let them imagine what was coming. Then he would give them 5 seconds to surrender. If they didn't, he'd burn them out according to standard procedure. But he believed they would surrender. He believed that fear of the flame was worse than the flame itself. His captain listened to this proposal and realized he had nothing to lose. Every conventional method had failed. Men were dying by the dozen. If this crazy plan worked, it would save American lives. If it didn't, well, they just resumed the assault with one less flamethrower operator. They sent him out at first light, alone, across that frozen clearing. The snow was knee-deep in places, and every step was visible to the German position. He carried 70 pounds of equipment, the dual-fuel tanks on his back, the ignition gun in his hands, moving slowly and deliberately. He didn't try to hide. He didn't zigzag or rush. He walked straight toward the first bunker, like a man approaching a neighbor's front door. The Germans held their fire. They could see what he was carrying. They knew exactly what was coming. The psychological impact of watching a flamethrower operator walk toward you in broad daylight, knowing you can kill him, but also knowing that his weapon has a dead man's trigger, that if you shoot him, the tanks might rupture and spray burning fuel everywhere, created a paralysis. Nobody wanted to be the one to pull trigger. He got within 30 yards of the first bunk stop. He could see the firing, see movement. He raised the ignition gun, pointed it skyward, and pulled the trigger. The flamethrower roared to life, sending a column of flame 20 feet into the air. The sound was like a dragon's breath, a sustained roar that echoed through the forest. He held it for 3 seconds, then shut it off. The silence that followed, absolute. Then he called out in the limited German he'd learned from other prisoners, 5 seconds to come out or burn. He counted slowly. At 4, the bunker's rear door opened, and 6 Wehrmacht soldiers emerged with their hands up, their faces white with terror. They'd chosen life over fire. He had them sit in the snow, then moved to the second bunker, and repeated the process. Bunker after bunker fell the same way. He would approach, ignite the flamethrower as a demonstration, give them the countdown, and watch them emerge. Some bunkers surrendered faster than others. One group came out after just 2 seconds. Another waited until he reached one in the count before the door flew open. By noon, he'd cleared all 8 positions without firing a shot in anger, without directing flame at a single human target. 47 German soldiers sat in the snow as prisoners, alive and unharmed. The American advance resumed. The strong point that had held up an entire division for 3 days fell without additional casualties on either side. It should have been the perfect combat action, a textbook example of psychological warfare achieving what firepower couldn't. But that's not how the story ended. Word of what he'd done spread through the chain of command faster than any after-action report. Within a week, officers from division headquarters were interviewing, trying to understand exactly how he'd pulled it off. Other flamethrower units wanted to know the detail. The technique seemed like a miracle, a way to neutralize fortified positions without the horrific casualties that normally accompanied bunker clearing operations. But as the reports moved up the chain, someone at theater headquarters raised a question that changed everything. Was this actually legal under the laws of war? The Geneva Conventions were clear about certain things, and one of them was the prohibition against causing unnecessary suffering, using a weapon specifically to terrorize the enemy into surrender, using the threat of burning alive as a coercive tool that lived in a gray area that made the lawyers extremely uncomfortable. The issue wasn't that he'd taken prisoners. The issue was the method. By international law, a weapon could be used for its intended purpose, but deliberately weaponizing the fear of that weapon, using it as a terror tool rather than a combat tool that crossed a line. The flamethrower was legal because it destroyed fortifications. Using it as a psychological torture device to force surrender was something else entirely. The debates went back and forth at levels far above a private first class in a rifle company. Meanwhile, he was still in the forest, still fighting, still carrying his flamethrower. He tried the technique twice more, with similar success. But after the 3rd time, new orders came down from Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary. The technique was banned. Flamethrower operators were instructed to use their weapons only for their intended purpose: destruction of enemy fortifications and personnel through the application of fire. Any use of the weapon solely for psychological effect was prohibited. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The ban didn't sit well with the men who'd been there, who'd seen what this technique accomplished. In their eyes, he'd found a way to win without killing, to achieve the objective while giving the enemy a chance to live. Wasn't that supposed to be the goal? Wasn't saving lives, even enemy lives, better than the alternative? But the military operates on rules, and those rules exist for reasons that go beyond individual battles. If every army started using weapons primarily as terror tools, where would it end? The concern was precedent. If Americans could use flamethrowers to terrorize enemies into surrender, what would stop enemies from doing the same thing, or worse? The laws of war exist because war without laws becomes something even more monstrous than it already is. He never spoke publicly about what happened. After the war, he went home to Pennsylvania, got married, worked in a steel mill for 37 years, and died in 1993 without ever telling his story to a journalist or historian. The only reason we know about it at all is because one of the men he saved that day, a rifleman who'd been pinned down by those bunkers for 2 days, wrote about it in a letter to his sister. That letter sat in a family attic until 2006, when a grandson found it and donated it to a military history archive. The details were verified through unit records and after-action reports, but the flamethrower operator's name was redacted in the official documents, listed only as PFC redacted, flamethrower operator, 3rd Platoon, Company B. The technique he invented died with the ban, but the questions it raised never went away. Military ethicists still debate it in war colleges. Is it more moral to kill efficiently or to terrorize effectively? Is a weapon that forces surrender through fear worse than a weapon that kills quickly? What if the fear is justified? If the threat is real? If the choice offered is genuine? These aren't abstract questions. They're the kind of moral puzzles that combat creates, and that no amount of peacetime philosophy can fully resolve. The men in those bunkers went home to Germany, lived their lives, had families. They survived because a 22-year-old from Pennsylvania figured out that sometimes the idea of death is a more powerful weapon than death itself. But there's another layer to this story that rarely gets discussed: the psychological cost of what he did. Killing the enemy in combat is one thing. Soldiers are trained for that, prepared for it, and there are frameworks for processing it afterward. But weaponizing fear, looking into a man's eyes and watching him break, not from what you've done, but from what you might do, that's a different kind of burden. He carried that with him for 50 years. The men he didn't kill haunted him more than the men he did. He'd saved their lives and broken something inside them at the same time. The soldiers who surrendered to him were never the same. Some of them ended up in POW camps where they were questioned about why they gave up fortified positions without a fight. The shame of that, the accusation of cowardice, it followed them for the rest of their lives. One of them, a German sergeant who'd been in the first bunker, was interviewed in 1987 for an oral history project. He described that moment in detail: the sound of the flamethrower igniting, the column of fire rising into the winter sky, the absolute certainty that he was about to die screaming. He said that he'd faced Russian tanks at Kursk, survived the bombardment at Caen, fought in the Ardennes, but nothing had ever terrified him the way that sound did. He surrendered not because he was a coward, but because the alternative was literally unthinkable. His mind couldn't process it. The primal human fear of burning alive overrode everything else. Every bit of training, every oath, every thought of duty or honor. He chose life, and he spent the next 40 years wondering if he'd made the right choice. That's the thing about war that doesn't fit into clean narratives. The choices aren't between good and evil. They're between different kinds of terrible, different shades of gray, different calculations of acceptable harm. This private found a way to win without killing, and the military banned it because the cost wasn't measured in bodies, but in something harder to quantify, something that violated the unwritten rules about how men should fight and die. There's supposed to be a certain dignity in combat, a mutual respect between warriors even in the act of trying to kill each other. Using terror as a weapon, even when it saves lives, undermines that dignity. It reduces men to their most basic fears, strips away everything that makes them soldiers, and forces them to confront their own mortality in the most visceral way possible. The ban also came from a practical concern that historians often overlook. If this technique became widespread, if every army started using it, the psychological impact would eventually wear off. Fear is only effective when it's rare. If soldiers knew that flamethrower operators were just going to use the weapon for show, they'd stop surrendering. Then the operators would have no choice but to follow through on the threat, and you'd end up right back where you started. Except now, you've established a pattern of psychological torture before the actual killing. The military understood that the technique worked precisely because it was unexpected, because it violated the normal rules of engagement. Institutionalizing it would destroy its effectiveness and create new problems worse than the ones it solved. There's also the question of what this did to the soldiers who witnessed it. American troops watching this happen had mixed reactions. Some thought it was brilliant. Others were deeply uncomfortable. War creates a certain mental framework that allows men to function in impossible situations. You learn to see the enemy as a threat to be neutralized. You learn to divorce the act of killing from its moral weight. You tell yourself stories about duty and necessity, but watching someone weaponize pure terror, watching enemy soldiers break down and surrender not from being beaten, but from being afraid, that complicated the framework. It made some men wonder what separated them from the enemy, what made their side's tactics acceptable and the other side's not. Those questions don't help soldiers sleep at night. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. After the war, the United States military conducted extensive reviews of weapon systems and combat techniques used in Europe and the Pacific. The reports on flamethrowers were particularly detailed because the weapon had proven so effective yet so controversial. Flamethrowers had cleared Japanese bunkers on Iwo Jima, routed German positions in the Siegfried Line, and become one of the most requested support weapons in close-quarters combat. But they also generated more complaints from chaplains, more instances of combat trauma among operators, and more questions from international observers than any other weapon except perhaps strategic bombing. The review boards had to balance military effectiveness against long-term moral and legal implications. The conclusion they reached was that flamethrowers were acceptable as destructive tools, but not as psychological weapons. The distinction mattered. A weapon used to destroy a bunker, and everyone in it was within the bounds of warfare. A weapon used to threaten destruction in order to force surrender crossed into coercion. The difference seems thin, almost semantic, but it's the line that separates lawful combat from torture. Torture extracts compliance through fear of pain. Combat extracts victory through application of force. What this private did occupied an uncomfortable middle ground. He applied force symbolically, used the weapon's capability as leverage, and extracted surrender through demonstrated threat rather than harm. The military decided that precedent was too dangerous to allow. Interestingly, the same reviews that banned this technique also led to changes in how flamethrowers were used going forward. By Korea, the weapon had been largely phased out of infantry use in favor of tank-mounted systems that created distance between the operator and the psychological impact. By Vietnam, flamethrowers were rarely used against personnel at all, primarily employed to clear vegetation and destroy structures. The weapon that had been so effective in World War II became a relic because the moral and psychological costs outweighed the tactical benefits. Modern militaries have abandoned flamethrowers almost entirely, not because they don't work, but because what they do to both the enemy and the operator is considered unacceptable by contemporary standards. Yet the fundamental question this story raises remains unresolved. Is it better to kill the enemy quickly or to terrorize them into surrender? Most people's instinct is to say that surrender is better, that saving lives is always the moral choice. But what if the terror required to force that surrender creates psychological damage worse than death? What if the soldiers who surrender carry that moment of absolute fear for the rest of their lives, wake up screaming from nightmares decades later, lose the ability to function as husbands and fathers because they can't forget the sound of that flame? The German sergeant who was interviewed in 1987 admitted that he'd had recurring nightmares about fire for 40 years. He'd see that column of flame in his dreams, feel the heat on his face, smell the fuel, and wake up in a panic. His wife said he couldn't be in a room with a fireplace. The smell of lighter fluid at a barbecue would send him into a dissociative state. He survived the war physically intact, but psychologically shattered. The American private who invented the technique carried his own scars. According to his daughter, who was interviewed after his death, he never told war stories. He never joined veterans' organizations. He never attended reunions. He kept his service medals in a drawer and never displayed them. She said that occasionally, late at night, she'd find him sitting in the garage, staring at nothing. And when she asked what was wrong, he'd say he was thinking about the men he didn't kill. She didn't understand what that meant until after he died, when she found the letters. He'd kept letters from 3 of the German soldiers he'd taken prisoner. Letters they'd sent him after the war through the Red Cross. All 3 letters said essentially the same thing. Thank you for my life, and I'm sorry for what it cost you to give it. They understood, in a way his own command never did, that what he'd done to them was both mercy and violation, both salvation and trauma. This is the paradox at the heart of modern warfare. We want to believe that there are clean solutions, that intelligence and innovation can reduce the horror, that the right technique can win battles without moral compromise. But war doesn't work that way. Every choice carries a cost. Every victory leaves scars. This private found a way to clear 8 bunkers without firing a shot, saved dozens of lives on both sides, and ended up haunting himself and the men he saved for the rest of their lives. The military banned his technique, not because it didn't work, but because it worked too well, because it revealed something about the nature of war that nobody wanted to acknowledge, that sometimes the most effective weapon is the one that breaks men's minds instead of their bodies, and that might be worse. The legal and ethical frameworks we use to regulate warfare are built on assumptions about what's acceptable and what isn't. It's acceptable to kill an enemy soldier with a bullet. It's acceptable to destroy a bunker with explosives. It's even acceptable under certain circumstances to burn fortifications with flamethrowers. But it's not acceptable to use the threat of burning as a tool of psychological coercion. Why? Because the law recognizes that there are things worse than death, that the manner of death matters, that preserving human dignity even in war is important. A soldier killed by a bullet dies quickly. A soldier burned alive dies in agony. A soldier forced to surrender by the threat of burning alive doesn't die at all. But something in him is killed anyway. Something that maybe can't be restored. The Germans who surrendered to this private went into POW camps where they were interrogated, processed, and eventually repatriated. Many of them had fought on the Eastern Front before being transferred west. They'd seen horrors that would have broken most men. But when asked about their worst experience of the war, several of them cited that moment in the forest, watching the flame rise into the sky, knowing what it meant, choosing surrender over fire. One of them said that facing Russian tanks didn't scare him, because he could fight tanks. You could hide, you could run, you could get lucky. But you can't fight fire. Fire doesn't miss. Fire doesn't run out of ammunition. Fire doesn't care about courage or training or anything else. It just consumes. The psychological impact of facing a weapon that offers no possibility of survival, no chance to fight back, no opportunity for courage to matter, it's devastating in a way that conventional weapons aren't. This is why flamethrowers became so controversial. and why their use declined so rapidly after World War II. The weapon violated something fundamental about how humans think combat should work. There's supposed to be a chance, however small, of survival through skill or luck. Flamethrowers eliminated that chance. You either weren't hit, or you died screaming. There was no middle ground, no wounded survivors, no stories of miraculous escapes. The weapon was binary in a way that made it psychologically intolerable. What this private discovered was that you didn't even need to use the weapon to achieve that psychological impact. Just the demonstration, just the promise of what was coming, was enough to break men who'd survived years of combat. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The ban on his technique went into effect in January 1945, and he received the order personally from his company commander. There was no reprimand, no suggestion that he'd done anything wrong. The order simply stated that flamethrowers were to be used only for their intended purpose, and that psychological warfare applications were to be handled by specialized units using approved methods. He accepted the order without complaint, and went back to standard bunker clearing procedures for the remainder of the war. He survived the war, which in itself was remarkable given that most flamethrower operators didn't. The weapon he carried marked him as a priority target, and the only reason he lived was a combination of luck and the fact that the Germans were, by early 1945, running short on everything including ammunition and the will to fight. His story raises questions that military ethicists are still grappling with today. Modern warfare has introduced weapons and techniques that make World War II flamethrowers look primitive. Drones that can kill with precision from thousands of miles away. Psychological operations that use social media to destabilize entire populations. Cyber weapons that can destroy infrastructure without firing a shot. Each of these technologies forces us to ask the same question this private's technique raised. Just because we can do something, should we? Just because a method is effective, is it acceptable? Just because we can win without killing, does that make it right if the alternative is psychological devastation? The United States military has, over the decades since World War II, developed extensive rules of engagement and ethical guidelines designed to prevent the kind of moral ambiguity this story represents. Soldiers are trained not just in tactics, but in the law of armed conflict, in the Geneva Conventions, in the principles that are supposed to govern how wars are fought. But no amount of training can eliminate the fundamental tension between military necessity and moral principle. Sometimes, the most effective tactic is one that violates the spirit of the law, even if it complies with the letter. Sometimes the choices available are all bad, and you have to pick the least terrible option and live with the consequences. What makes this story particularly powerful is that it wasn't a general making strategic decisions in a headquarters building. It was a 22-year-old kid from Pennsylvania making split-second calculations in a frozen forest with people trying to kill him. He didn't have lawyers or ethicists or review boards. He had a weapon, a problem, and an idea. He executed that idea 3 times, saved dozens of lives, and created a moral crisis that the military is still sorting through 80 years later. That's the reality of combat. The consequences of individual decisions can echo for generations, can change policy, can alter how entire armies think about warfare. The men who surrendered to him, the 47 German soldiers who walked out of those bunkers with their hands up, they made a choice that day too. They chose life over death, survival over honor, fear over duty. In the moment, it seemed like the only rational choice. But choices made under extreme duress carry their own weight. Some of those men were ostracized by fellow POWs who thought they'd given up too easily. Some faced accusations of cowardice after the war. Some struggled with guilt and shame for decades. The simple fact of survival became complicated by how they survived, by the choice they made, by the fear that drove them to make it. This is what war does. It creates impossible situations where every choice is terrible, and you have to make one anyway. It puts people in positions where their survival depends on decisions that will haunt them forever. It asks ordinary people to make moral calculations that philosophers spend lifetimes debating, and then it judges them afterward, applies rules and standards that may not have existed when the choices were made, and expects them to live with the consequences. The private who cleared those bunkers did what seemed smart and humane in the moment. The military decided afterward that it wasn't acceptable. Neither side was wrong. That's the tragedy. One of the most difficult aspects of studying World War II history is confronting the gap between how we think wars should be fought and how they actually were. We want to believe in clean moral lines, in heroes and villains, in right and wrong. The reality is infinitely more complex. Good people did terrible things for understandable reasons. Terrible people occasionally made choices that saved lives. The same weapon could be used for mass murder or tactical necessity depending on context. The same technique could be brilliant or banned depending on who was evaluating it. This private story embodies all of that complexity. He was neither a hero nor a war criminal. He was a soldier trying to survive and complete his mission, who stumbled onto something that nobody knew how to categorize. The letters he received from the German soldiers he captured are particularly revealing. They weren't angry. They didn't accuse him of anything. They thanked him, but their gratitude was complicated, tinged with something that might have been resentment. One letter said, "You gave me my life, but you took something from me too. I don't know if I can ever be the man I was before that day. Sometimes I think it would have been easier to die with honor than to live with this." That's an extraordinary admission. The soldier is acknowledging that the mercy he received came with a cost that might have exceeded the value of his survival. He's saying that death might have been preferable to the psychological burden of choosing life through surrender under those circumstances. This raises an uncomfortable question that the military couldn't fully address then and still struggles with now. Do we have the right to save someone's life if it means destroying who they are? Is physical survival worth psychological devastation? The standard answer is yes. Life is always worth preserving. But the people who actually went through these experiences sometimes disagree. Some of them carry wounds that never heal, nightmares that never end, guilt and shame and fear that poison every day they have. The private who invented this technique understood that on some level. That's why he never celebrated what he did, never sought recognition, never told the story. He knew that what looked like a bloodless victory had its own body count, just one that didn't show up in the casualty reports. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The broader implications of this story extend far beyond one soldier and 8 bunkers in a German forest. The technique was banned, but the principle behind it, using fear as a weapon, never went away. Every army in the world uses psychological warfare in some form. The difference is how explicit it is, how regulated it is, and whether the fear is incidental to the weapon's purpose or the entire point. Modern militaries have entire departments devoted to psychological operations, to understanding how to break enemy morale without firing shots. They study propaganda, they analyze social media, they develop techniques to terrorize adversaries into compliance. The only difference between what this private did and what PSYOP specialists do today is that his method was more direct, more personal, more viscerally effective. The ban on his specific technique was about drawing a line, establishing that there are limits even in war, but lines drawn during wartime have a tendency to move depending on circumstances. What was banned in 1945 because it seemed too cruel might be reconsidered if the stakes were high enough. What seems acceptable now might horrify people in 50 years. The moral framework we use to judge these things is constantly evolving, shaped by technology, by cultural values, by the specific conflicts we're engaged in. There's no permanent answer to the question of what's acceptable in war, because the question itself keeps changing. What remains constant is the human cost. Whether you kill a man or break him, whether you burn him alive or terrorize him into surrender, someone pays the price. Often that someone is the enemy, but sometimes it's you, the person who did the killing or the terrorizing. This private paid. The Germans who surrendered paid. The American soldiers who witnessed it paid. War distributes its costs unpredictably, often hitting hardest the people who were just trying to do the right thing. That's the real lesson of this story. There are no clean victories. There are no perfect solutions. Every choice in combat creates ripples that spread far beyond the immediate tactical situation, affecting lives and psyches in ways that won't be fully understood for decades.
His technique was brilliant in its simplicity and devastating in its effectiveness. It solved a tactical problem that had killed dozens of American soldiers. It saved lives on both sides.
And it was banned because the military recognized that some solutions are too dangerous to use even when they work. The precedent was too risky. The moral hazard was too great. The psychological cost was too high. Better to accept the casualties that come with conventional tactics than to open the door to weaponized terror, even terror that leads to surrender rather than death. That calculation might seem cold, might seem to prioritize abstract principles over concrete lives, but it reflects a deep understanding of what war does to people and societies. The flamethrower operator who cleared 8 bunkers without firing a shot discovered something fundamental about human nature and the psychology of fear. He found the edge where survival instinct overrides everything else, where training and discipline and courage all break down in the face of absolute terror. He weaponized that edge and proved it could win battles. But he also proved that victories achieved through pure psychological terror come with costs that may not be worth paying. The men he saved, both American and German, carried scars that never healed. He carried the weight of what he'd done to them, and the military carried the knowledge that this capability existed that it worked, and that it could never be used again because the price was too high. This is the kind of story that doesn't fit comfortable narratives about World War II. We want to believe that the war was fought by heroes against villains, that the choices were clear, that right prevailed over wrong. The truth is messier. The war was fought by ordinary people forced into extraordinary circumstances, making impossible choices with incomplete information, and living with the consequences for the rest of their lives. Some of those choices looked heroic and turned out to be nightmare. Some looked terrible and turned out to save lives. Most existed in the gray area between, where good intentions and bad outcomes mixed together in ways that defy simple moral judgment. The private who cleared those bunkers was trying to do the right thing. He was trying to accomplish his mission with minimal casualty. He succeeded brilliantly, and he created a situation so morally complex that the military banned the technique and buried his name in redacted documents. That's not a condemnation of him or the military. It's recognition that war forces people and institutions to confront questions that have no good answers, only different kinds of bad ones. He chose one path. The military chose another. The German soldiers who surrendered made their choice. None of them were wrong. None of them were entirely right. That's the nature of moral decisions in war. What happened in that forest in December 1944 was simultaneously an act of mercy and an act of psychological violence. It was tactically brilliant and ethically troubling. It saved lives and destroyed minds. It was everything and nothing that warfare is supposed to be. The fact that we're still talking about it 80 years later, still debating whether it was right or wrong, still trying to understand the implications, proves how significant it was. One soldier with a weapon and an idea changed how armies think about the relationship between killing and winning, between fear and force, between what's effective and what's acceptable. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The final chapter of this story belongs to the men who were there, both the Americans who witnessed it and the Germans who experienced it. Their accounts, scattered through letters and interviews conducted decades after the war, paint a picture of profound ambivalence. None of them regretted surviving. None of them wanted to relive that day. None of them could shake the feeling that something important had been taken from them in that moment. Something that had nothing to do with life or death, but everything to do with who they understood themselves to be. Warriors are supposed to fight. They're supposed to face death with courage. They're supposed to have the chance to be brave or cowardly, to succeed or fail on their own terms. What this private did to them removed that agency. He gave them a choice that wasn't really a choice. Surrender or burn, and the fact that surrender was obviously the right decision didn't make it any easier to live with. The American soldiers who saw it happen had their own reactions. Some admired the ingenuity, some were disturbed by the psychological warfare aspect. Most were just glad that the bunkers were cleared and they could advance without walking into machine gun fire. War simplifies certain moral calculations. When people are shooting at you, you tend to support whatever stops them from shooting, and you worry about the ethics later, if at all. But some of the men who witnessed this technique couldn't shake the feeling that they'd crossed a line, that what they'd seen was fundamentally different from the killing they'd done or seen done. It wasn't the violence that bothered them, it was the lack of it, the use of threatened violence to achieve psychological domination. It felt wrong, even though it achieved exactly the outcome everyone wanted. The private himself never fully articulated his feelings about what he'd done. His family found journals after his death, and there are entries that reference the war, but they're elliptical, unclear, fragments of thought rather than complete narratives. One entry from the 1970s reads, "Wonder today if those men ever think about me the way I think about them. Probably not. They went home. They moved on. I'm the one who can't let go." Another entry from the 1980s. "Saved lives. Ruined lives. Same action. How is that possible?" These aren't the thoughts of a man at peace with his choices. They're the thoughts of someone still wrestling with moral questions that have no answers, still trying to reconcile what seemed right in the moment with what felt wrong afterward. One of the most poignant aspects of this story is that it demonstrates the inadequacy of our moral frameworks for dealing with the reality of combat. We have rules and laws and ethical guidelines, and they're important. They serve vital purposes, but they can't capture the full complexity of situations like this. They can't account for context, for intent, for outcomes both intended and unintended. They reduce moral decisions to binary choices, legal or illegal, right or wrong, when the reality is that most combat decisions exist in a space where multiple contradictory things are simultaneously true. This technique was both humane and cruel. It was both brilliant and wrong. It saved lives and caused lasting harm. All of those things are true at the same time, and no rule or regulation can fully address that complexity. The military's decision to ban the technique was pragmatic rather than purely moral. They recognized that allowing it would set a precedent that could be exploited and expanded in dangerous ways. If using flamethrowers for psychological effect was acceptable, what about other weapons? What about using the threat of chemical weapons to force surrender? What about demonstrating what a nuclear weapon could do and then demanding capitulation? The slippery slope was real and steep, and the only way to avoid sliding down it was to draw a clear line. Weapons are for fighting, not for terrorizing. Use them for their intended purpose, or don't use them at all. It's a good rule, a necessary rule, even if it means banning techniques that save lives in specific circumstances. But rules come with costs. The cost of this rule was measured in the American casualties that occurred in subsequent bunker-clearing operations that had to be conducted conventionally, with explosives and close-quarters combat, and all the death that entails. How many men died clearing bunkers after this technique was banned? Who might have lived if it had been allowed? That's an impossible question to answer, and it's probably the wrong question anyway. The right question is whether the precedent of allowing psychological warfare using weapons of terror was worth the lives it might have saved in the short term. The military decided it wasn't. Reasonable people can disagree about that decision, but it wasn't made casually or without understanding the implications. What we're left with is a story that resists simple interpretation. A soldier did something extraordinary that violated no existing rules, but created new ones to prevent it from happening again. He saved lives and caused suffering. He was innovative and disturbing. He survived the war and spent 50 years haunted by his mercy. The men he saved thanked him and resented him. The military studied his technique and banned it. Every part of this story contains contradictions that can't be resolved, only acknowledged and accepted as part of the terrible complexity of war. In the end, what this story teaches us is that war forces people to make choices that have no good options, only different kinds of cost. It teaches us that effectiveness isn't the same as rightness, that saving lives isn't always an absolute good if the method violates fundamental principles about human dignity. It teaches us that the gap between what we can do and what we should do is sometimes vast, and that navigating that gap requires wisdom that most people, especially young soldiers in combat, don't possess. It teaches us that the consequences of our choices ripple forward in time in ways we can't predict or control, that what seems right in the moment might be judged differently later, and that moral certainty is a luxury combat rarely affords. The flamethrower operator who cleared 8 bunkers without burning anyone accomplished something that seemed impossible. He proved that psychological warfare could be more effective than physical destruction. He found a way to win without killing, and in doing so, he created a moral puzzle that has no solution, only different perspectives, different values, different calculations of acceptable cost. His story deserves to be remembered not as an example of heroism or villainy, but as an illustration of how complicated war really is, how the choices that seem clear in retrospect were agonizing in the moment, and how the people who fight our wars carry burdens that the rest of us can barely imagine. He was a private first class from Pennsylvania who had an idea. That idea changed military policy. It saved dozens of lives and scarred dozens more. It was banned and studied and debated for 80 years. And through it all, the man himself remained silent, carrying his secrets and his doubts to a grave marked only with his name and dates. No mention of service or sacrifice or the thing he did that nobody talks about. That silence is its own kind of statement, a refusal to claim credit or accept blame, an acknowledgement that some stories are too complicated for heroes and villains, too morally ambiguous for triumph or tragedy. Some stories are just what happened when people tried their best in impossible situations and lived with the consequences. This is one of those stories. Remember it, not as a lesson in what to do or what not to do, but as a reminder that the cost of war isn't always measured in bodies. Sometimes it's measured in nightmares and doubt and questions that have no answers, carried by people who did what they thought was right and spent the rest of their lives wondering if they were wrong. The winter of 1944 was unforgiving in ways that went beyond the cold and the snow. The Hurtgen Forest campaign had become a meat grinder that consumed men faster than replacements could arrive. By the time this private cleared those 8 bunkers, his company had been reduced to less than half its authorized strength. The regiment had lost entire platoon. The division was operating on sheer determination, and the knowledge that stopping meant giving the Germans time to reinforce, time to prepare, time to kill more Americans when the advance inevitably resumed. There was no option to pause, no opportunity to reconsider strategy, no luxury of fighting the war according to peacetime ethics. The mission was to move forward, to take ground, to break through German defenses and to do it before winter made further operations impossible. Context matters when evaluating what he did. This wasn't a peacetime exercise. This wasn't a training scenario where you could stop and debate the implications. This was combat at its most brutal, in terrain that favored the defender absolutely, against an enemy that had 4 years of experience building fortifications and killing Americans who tried to take them. The bunkers he faced weren't crude holes in the ground. They were engineered positions with interlocking fields of fire, reinforced with logs and earth thick enough to withstand direct artillery hits, positioned to cover every approach. Taking them conventionally meant accepting casualties that the company could no longer afford. His solution, however controversial it later became, emerged from genuine tactical necessity, not from cruelty or desire to terrify. Understanding his background helps explain how he arrived at this technique. He'd been a volunteer firefighter in his hometown before the war. He understood fire in ways that most soldiers didn't. He'd seen what it did to buildings, to people, to the psychology of communities facing it. He knew that fire creates a panic response that's deeper than rational fear, something primal that bypasses logical thinking. When he was assigned to flamethrower duty, he approached it differently than most operators. They saw it as a weapon. He saw it as a force of nature that he happened to control. That perspective gave him insights that others missed. He understood that the power of fire wasn't just in its destructive capacity, but in its psychological presence, in what it represented to human consciousness. His first 2 combat experiences with the flamethrower had been conventional bunker assaults, and both had left him shaken. The first time, he'd burned out a German position and then had to walk past the aftermath. The smell stayed with him for days. The second time, one of the Germans had run from the bunker on fire, screaming, and another American soldier had to shoot him to end the suffering. That image haunted him. He started thinking about whether there was a way to achieve the same tactical result without creating the kind of memories that would poison his mind for whatever time he had left. The technique he developed came from that desire, from trying to find a method that was effective but less psychologically devastating to everyone involved. The irony is that his attempt to reduce the psychological cost of combat created a different kind of psychological damage, one that was perhaps worse because it was less visible, less immediate, less acknowledged. The men he burned died terrible deaths, but they died. The men he terrorized into surrender lived, but they lived with the memory of that terror, with the knowledge of how completely they'd broken, with the shame of choosing life when their training and culture told them that honor demanded they fight to the end. He traded one kind of trauma for another, and the military's eventual decision was that the second kind was more dangerous, more corrosive, more likely to create long-term problems that extended beyond the battlefield. The 3 German soldiers who wrote to him after the war did so independently, through different channels at different times. None of them knew about the others until much later. The first letter arrived in 1947, forwarded through the International Red Cross. It was from the sergeant who'd been in the first bunker, and it was both a thank you note and a confession. He thanked the private for accepting their surrender, for not killing them when he had every right to do so. But he also described the years since, the nightmares, the inability to be around fire, the way his wife looked at him when he woke up screaming. He said that he'd tried to explain to her what had happened, but she couldn't understand how someone could be traumatized by something that didn't actually happen, by a threat that was never carried out. How do you explain to someone who wasn't there that the fear itself was the weapon, that the psychological impact was worse than physical wounds? The second letter came in 1953, from a younger soldier who'd been in the 4th bunker. This one was angrier, more accusatory. He said that what the private had done was worse than killing them would have been. He said that they'd all lived with the shame of surrender, that their families didn't understand, that other veterans looked at them differently when they found out they'd given up a fortified position without firing a shot. He said that he'd considered suicide multiple times, that the only thing stopping him was the knowledge that it would confirm what everyone already thought, that he was a coward. The letter didn't explicitly blame the private, but the subtext was clear. You did this to us. You broke us in ways that can't be fixed, and we have to live with it while you go home to your normal life. The third letter arrived in 1961 and was different in tone from the other 2. This soldier, who'd been in the 6th bunker, had become a pastor after the war. He wrote about forgiveness and understanding, about the choices people make under impossible circumstances, about the weight of survival and the burden of mercy. He said that he'd struggled for years with what happened, with the decision to surrender, with the fear that drove that decision, but he'd come to see it as a moment of grace, however strangely delivered. He'd lived when he should have died. He'd had children who wouldn't exist if he'd chosen differently. He'd spent 16 years helping his community, counseling people, trying to do good in the world. None of that would have happened if the private had used the flamethrower as intended. So this letter was genuine gratitude, but it was also an acknowledgement of cost. He said, "You gave me everything I have, and I thank you for it. But I also want you to know that it came with a price that I'm still paying. I don't blame you for that. I just want you to know that your mercy had weight." If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. These letters shaped how the private thought about what he'd done for the rest of his life. He kept them in a locked box in his workshop, never showed them to anyone, never discussed them. His daughter found them after he died, along with drafts of responses he'd written but never sent. The drafts reveal a man struggling to articulate feelings that had no adequate language. He tried to explain that he'd been trying to save lives, that he'd thought giving them a choice was better than giving them death, but he also acknowledged that he'd never considered the long-term consequences, never thought about what surrender under those circumstances would mean for them afterward. One draft, dated 1962, includes this line, "I thought I was being merciful. I didn't understand that mercy can be its own kind of cruelty." The military's investigation into the technique was more thorough than most people realize. It wasn't just a quick review and a ban. Multiple officers at different levels of command studied what happened, interviewed witnesses, consulted with chaplains and medical personnel, and tried to understand both the tactical effectiveness and the moral implication. The reports from this investigation, which were declassified in the 1990s, revealed genuine uncertainty about the right course of action. Some officers argued that anything that reduced casualties should be encouraged. Others pointed out that the psychological warfare aspects violated the spirit, if not the letter, of the Geneva Convention. Still others worried about precedent and what would happen if the enemy adopted similar techniques. One report, written by a major who'd been a philosophy professor before the war, got to the heart of the ethical dilemma. He wrote, "The question before us is not whether Private Redacted's actions were tactically sound. They clearly were. The question is whether we want our military to be in the business of weaponizing terror to such a degree that the enemy's fear becomes the primary instrument of victory. If we answer yes, we open doors that may be impossible to close. If we answer no, we accept that some effective techniques must be prohibited because their use would degrade who we are and what we're fighting for." That report recommended the ban, not as punishment for the private, but as a statement of principle about the kind of army America wanted to field. The ban itself was carefully worded to avoid any suggestion that the private had done something wrong. It simply stated that flamethrowers were to be used exclusively for their designed purpose of destroying fortifications and enemy personnel through the application of fire, and that psychological warfare applications were outside the scope of individual initiative and were to be coordinated through proper channels with specialized units. In practice, this meant that what he'd done was no longer permissible, but there was no retroactive discipline, no mark on his record, no suggestion that he'd violated any existing order. The new rule was prospective only. This careful language reflected the military's recognition that the situation was complex, that the private had acted in good faith, and that condemning him would be unjust even if his technique needed to be prohibited. But the ban had consequences beyond that one soldier. Flamethrower doctrine changed across the entire European theater. Operators were retrained, emphasizing the destructive rather than psychological aspects of the weapon. Tactical manuals were rewritten. The shift was subtle but real, moving away from the weapon's capacity to terrorize and toward its capacity to destroy. This change affected how bunkers were cleared for the rest of the war, and it almost certainly resulted in higher casualties, both American and German, than would have occurred if the technique had been allowed to spread. That cost was accepted as necessary to maintain the principle that weapons of terror, even terror that led to surrender rather than death, were incompatible with American values. The debate over this decision continued in military journals and war colleges for decades. In the 1950s, during the Korean War, similar questions arose about the use of napalm and other incendiary weapons. In the 1960s and 70s, Vietnam brought renewed attention to the psychological impact of various weapons and tactics. Each generation of military officers had to grapple with the same fundamental tension. How do you fight effectively while maintaining moral principles? How do you win wars without becoming the kind of people you're fighting against? This private story became a case study in those discussions, an example of how individual initiative in combat can create policy dilemmas that extend far beyond the battlefield. What's often lost in these academic discussions is the human element. The private wasn't thinking about Geneva Conventions or military ethics when he came up with his technique. He was thinking about staying alive and completing his mission. The Germans who surrendered weren't making philosophical decisions about honor versus survival. They were reacting to the most primal fear humans can experience, the fear of burning alive. The officers who banned the technique weren't trying to punish anyone. They were trying to prevent a precedent that could lead to worse outcome. Everyone involved was doing what seemed right, given their perspective and their responsibilities. The tragedy is that all of those right decisions added up to a situation where nobody won, where everyone carried scars, where the moral ledger never balanced. One aspect of this story that deserves more attention is the impact on the other American soldiers in the company. They saw what happened. They saw 8 bunkers surrender without a fight. They saw German soldiers walking out with their hands up, terrified, some of them crying, all of them broken in a way that conventional combat didn't usually produce. For some American soldiers, this was satisfying. The enemy was afraid, was defeated, was humiliated. Justice for all the American casualties those bunkers had caused. But for others, it was disturbing. They'd been trained to see the enemy as dangerous, as worthy opponents who had to be defeated through superior skill and courage. Seeing them reduced to terror, watching them surrender not from being beaten but from being afraid, it cheapened the victory somehow, made it feel less like combat and more like bullying. Several after-action reports from other soldiers in the company mentioned feeling uncomfortable with what they witnessed. One corporal wrote, "It was effective, but it didn't feel right. They weren't surrendering because we beat them. They were surrendering because they were too scared to fight." That's not the same thing. Another soldier, a sergeant with 3 years of combat experience, said, "I've seen men surrender before. This was different. They weren't defeated. They were broken. There's a difference, and it matters." These reactions didn't translate into formal complaints or objections, but they contributed to the overall sense that something about this technique crossed a line that needed to exist even in war. The psychological impact on the private himself manifested in ways that his family noticed, but didn't fully understand until after his death. He was functional, held a job, raised children, participated in community activities, but there were signs of something beneath the surface. He never celebrated the 4th of July, said the fireworks bothered him. He refused to have a fireplace in his house despite living in Pennsylvania where winters were harsh. He couldn't watch war movies. When his son joined the army in the 1970s, he didn't object, but he also didn't offer advice or share his own experiences. He existed in a kind of walled-off space where the war was concerned, keeping it separate from his daily life, but never fully leaving it behind. His daughter remembered one incident from her childhood that she didn't understand until she read the letters and journals. She was maybe 8 years old, and they were at a neighbor's house for a barbecue. The neighbor was having trouble getting the charcoal started and doused it with lighter fluid. When it ignited with that characteristic whoosh, her father dropped his plate and left immediately, didn't say goodbye, just walked home. Her mother made excuses, said he wasn't feeling well. But years later, reading about what he'd done in the war, she understood. That sound, that specific sound of fuel igniting, it took him back to the forest, to the bunkers, to the moment when he'd discovered that fear could be a weapon more powerful than fire itself. The Germans who surrendered to him went through their own post-war struggle. In the immediate aftermath, being a POW was relatively straightforward. They were processed, interrogated, housed in camps, and eventually repatriated. The American POW system was generally humane by the standards of the time. They were fed, clothed, given medical care. Some of them actually gained weight in captivity compared to how they'd been living in the field. But once they returned to Germany, they faced a different kind of challenge. Post-war Germany was a devastated country, physically and psychologically. Everyone had lost something or someone. Everyone had stories of suffering and sacrifice. In that context, being a soldier who'd surrendered without fighting was shameful in ways that were hard to articulate, but impossible to escape. The sergeant from the first bunker described this in his letter. He said that when he told people he'd been a POW, they asked where he was captured. When he said the Hürtgen forest, they assumed he'd been wounded or overwhelmed. When the truth came out, that he'd surrendered a fortified position because he was afraid of a flamethrower, the reactions changed. Not outright condemnation, but a subtle shift in how people looked at him, talked to him, thought about him. He became, in his community, the man who gave up. That reputation followed him for years, affecting his job prospects, his social standing, his sense of self-worth. He wrote, "You saved my life, but you also marked me. Every day, I live with both of those things, and I don't know which weighs more." The younger soldier who wrote the angry letter had an even harder time. He returned to a Germany that was being rebuilt by the very young and the very old, everyone else having been killed or captured. He was 23 years old, healthy, capable, and carrying the stigma of surrender. He struggled to find work because employers wanted men who'd proven themselves under pressure, not men who'd folded when things got difficult. He struggled with relationships because German women of that era had been through hell and had little patience for weakness. He ended up leaving Germany entirely, emigrating to Argentina in the early 1950s, where he could start over without the weight of his wartime record. His letter to the private was written from Buenos Aires, and it was essentially a goodbye, a way of closing that chapter of his life by confronting the man who'd defined it. The pastor, the one who'd found peace with what happened, had the most interesting trajectory. He'd been a theology student before the war, drafted into service, trained as a machine gunner, and sent to the Western Front. He'd killed Allied soldiers, done his duty as he understood it, and expected to die in combat. When he surrendered to the private, he experienced it as a kind of death and rebirth. The man he'd been, the soldier following orders, died in that moment of terror. The man who walked out of that bunker was someone new, someone who'd been given a second chance that he didn't deserve and didn't earn. That experience shaped his theology, his understanding of grace and mercy, his entire approach to ministry. He didn't glorify what happened. He recognized it as traumatic and wrong in some fundamental way, but he also couldn't deny that it had changed him in ways that he came to see as positive, even necessary. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The question of whether the technique should have been banned continues to generate debate among military historians and ethicists. Some argue that the ban was correct, that allowing the technique would have established a dangerous precedent and violated principles that are essential to maintaining some semblance of humanity in warfare. Others argue that the ban was a mistake, that it prioritized abstract ethical concerns over concrete lives, that the soldiers who died in subsequent bunker clearing operations paid the price for a decision made by people who weren't on the battlefield. Both positions have merit. Neither is definitively right or wrong. That's what makes this story so valuable as a teaching tool. It forces people to confront the reality that moral decisions in war rarely have clear answers. One argument in favor of the ban focuses on reciprocity. The laws of war exist partly to protect our own soldiers by establishing standards that all sides are expected to follow. If American forces used terror as a weapon, even terror that led to surrender, it gave enemy forces justification to do the same or worse. The Germans had their own flamethrowers, their own psychological warfare capabilities, their own capacity for innovation in the tools of terror. If the Americans had institutionalized this technique, the Germans would have responded in kind, and the result would have been an escalation of psychological warfare that would have made the conflict even more brutal and traumatic for everyone involved. The ban prevented that escalation by establishing that America wouldn't go down that path regardless of tactical advantages. The counter-argument is that the Germans were already using every tool at their disposal, including terror tactics, and that American restraint didn't prevent German brutality, it just left American soldiers at a disadvantage. The Wehrmacht used psychological warfare extensively, from the intimidating sound of Stukas to the propaganda broadcasts, to the deliberate mutilation of bodies to terrorize advancing troops. American self-imposed limitations didn't make the Germans more humane. They just made American operations more costly. From this perspective, the ban was a kind of moral vanity, a way for people far from the fighting to feel good about American values, while soldiers paid the price in blood. This argument has emotional power, especially when you consider the specific casualties that occurred in bunker clearing operations after the ban was implemented. But there's a deeper issue that both sides of this debate sometimes miss. The decision wasn't really about this specific technique. It was about the kind of military America wanted to be. Every army faces moments where effectiveness conflicts with values, where winning quickly conflicts with fighting honorably, where survival conflicts with principle. The choices made in those moments define the institution and the nation it represents. The military chose to prioritize long-term principles over short-term tactical gains. That choice had costs, measured in American lives, but it also had benefits, measured in the preservation of standards that prevent war from devolving into absolute barbarism. Whether the trade-off was worth it depends on what you value more: the lives of specific identifiable individuals or the maintenance of principles that protect countless unnamed future soldiers. The private himself never publicly took a position on whether the ban was right or wrong. His journals suggest he understood both sides. In one entry he wrote, "They had to ban it. I understand why, but I also know that men died because they did. Men who might have lived. I carry both of those truths, and I don't know how to reconcile them." That's probably the most honest assessment anyone can make. The situation was genuinely tragic in the classical sense. Multiple incompatible goods in conflict, no way to choose one without sacrificing another, no resolution that doesn't leave someone bearing an unfair burden. What made the technique so effective also made it so troubling. It worked precisely because it tapped into the deepest, most primal human fear. Fire is uniquely terrible as a way to die. It's slow enough that you're conscious through most of it. It's painful in ways that exceed almost any other form of death. It leaves you helpless, unable to fight back or escape. The human mind is hardwired to fear fire in ways that transcend rational calculation. That's why the threat of it was so devastating. The German soldiers in those bunkers weren't making tactical decisions when they surrendered. They were responding to a fear so profound that it overrode every other consideration. Using that fear as a weapon was effective, but it was also a kind of violation, an exploitation of psychological vulnerability that felt different from conventional combat. Modern military psychology recognizes different categories of combat trauma. There's trauma from witnessing death, from killing, from being in danger, from losing comrades. But there's also trauma from helplessness, from being forced into situations where you have no agency, no ability to fight or resist or even make meaningful choices. The German soldiers who surrendered to the flamethrower threat experienced that kind of trauma. They were reduced to pure fear, stripped of their identity as soldiers, forced to choose between two terrible options with no opportunity for courage or resistance. That kind of experience can be more psychologically damaging than conventional combat, because it's harder to integrate into a coherent narrative of who you are and what happened to you. The American military's understanding of these issues has evolved significantly since World War II. Modern training includes far more emphasis on the psychological dimensions of warfare, on the long-term impact of combat trauma, on the importance of maintaining ethical standards even under pressure. The flamethrower story is sometimes used in military ethics courses as a case study in why rules exist, why effectiveness isn't the only consideration, why the military has to balance tactical success against broader concern. It's a useful teaching tool precisely because it's complicated, because there's no obvious right answer, because it forces students to grapple with real moral complexity rather than simple scenarios with clear heroes and villains. But all of this analysis, all of these debates and discussions and ethical frameworks, they exist at a remove from the actual experience. The private who cleared those bunkers wasn't thinking about psychological warfare theory or the Geneva Conventions or long-term policy implications. He was thinking about staying alive, completing his mission, and ideally not creating the kind of memories that would haunt him forever. He failed at that last goal. The memories haunted him anyway, just in a different form than they would have if he'd burned the bunkers conventionally. Instead of seeing men die screaming, he saw them break and surrender. Instead of carrying the weight of killing, he carried the weight of mercy that felt like violation. Different burden, same crushing weight. The Germans who surrendered weren't thinking about honor or duty or military culture. They were thinking about fire, about burning, about pain beyond comprehension. They made the only choice their minds could process in that moment. Then they had to live with it, had to explain it, had to carry it through decades of peacetime life where nobody quite understood why surrender under those circumstances felt different from surrender under conventional threat. How do you explain to someone who wasn't there that being afraid of bullets is normal, but being terrified into complete psychological collapse by the threat of fire is different, is shameful, is something that marks you forever? One of the most important lessons from this story is about the limits of innovation in warfare. Military organizations prize innovation, reward soldiers who find new ways to achieve objectives, encourage creative thinking about tactical problems. But innovation in war is dangerous precisely because it's effective. New techniques spread quickly. What starts as one soldier's improvisation can become standard practice across an entire army within months. That's why the military has to be cautious about which innovations to encourage and which to prohibit. The criteria can't just be effectiveness. It has to include considerations of long-term impact, of precedent, of who you want your military to be, beyond just winning battles. The private's technique was innovative and effective. It was also dangerous as a precedent. If it had been allowed to spread, flamethrower operators across the European theater would have started using it. Then the Germans would have responded, either with similar techniques or with stricter orders to their troops never to surrender under any circumstances. The result would likely have been an escalation that made combat even more brutal, that eliminated the possibility of surrender as a viable option, that forced more fights to the death. The military saw that potential future and decided to prevent it by banning the technique before it could spread. That decision saved lives in ways that are impossible to quantify because they prevented things that never happened. But it also cost lives in ways that are very quantifiable. After the ban, bunkers had to be cleared conventionally. That meant close assault with grenades and small arms fire, with all the casualties that entails. The specific number is unknowable, but it's certain that American soldiers died clearing bunkers that might have surrendered if the technique had been allowed. Those deaths are real and specific. The deaths prevented by the ban are hypothetical and general. That asymmetry makes it emotionally difficult to defend the ban, even if it was strategically and ethically correct. We mourn specific losses more than we celebrate prevented catastrophes. The soldiers who died after the ban have names and families and graves. The soldiers who might have died in a future escalation of psychological warfare don't exist to be mourned. This is the impossible mathematics of military ethics. You're trying to balance known costs against unknown benefits, trying to weigh specific lives against abstract principles, trying to make decisions that will affect thousands of people in ways you can't fully predict. The officers who made the decision to ban the technique did the best they could with the information and values they had. So did the private who invented it. So did the German soldiers who surrendered. Everyone was doing what seemed right from their perspective. The tragedy is that all those right decisions created a situation where everyone suffered, where nobody escaped unscathed, where the victory was tainted by the cost of achieving it.